Morgan and John for this evening's talk about the permacrisis and what's happening in Italy and beyond in that context. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Simon. It's a pleasure to be here again, just a short while after the Italian elections. And it's such a wonderful gift to be able to hear it directly from John Hooper, a great friend, but also one of the most insightful journalists and I think thinkers about Italian society and politics. So what we did last time is maybe just start with domestic policy and see how much things have changed or not changed, and then perhaps move to the European level and then the broader international setting. So just I guess for some context, it's often understood that it's easier to be at the opposition than it is to govern. And it's been a bit of a shaky start for Meloni and her coalition government. They're inheriting obviously a lot of debt. Italy has, I think, 152% ratio of debt to GDP. A European Union that has some pretty strict guidelines and guardrails around being part of the EU. But let's start with perhaps her difficulty in appointing a finance minister. Can you just walk us through a little bit what happened?
Yes. See if that is working, the microphone. It is, yes, I'm getting some thumbs up. Maybe we could even start with some good news, because I have it on excellent authority that the government has shelved its plans for the ethnic cleansing of the Chianti. With regard to their finance minister, yes, she ran into difficulty because the idea originally was to get a technocrat who was well known in Europe, who would be able to convince people that this was a government that wasn't going to be too radical. And what they discovered was that nobody wanted to go near the job. Nobody who was qualified. The government was just too toxic in their view. So she ended up having to appoint a politician, Giancarlo Giorgetti, who is from the League, but highly qualified for the job because he used to be the president of the Parliamentary Budget Commission, and so has qualifications for being able to do the main job that he's got to do at the moment, which is to get the current budget through Parliament by the 31st of December. After that, I think that he nevertheless will be somebody who is capable of carrying the load, so to speak, and in some ways possibly a better choice than a technocrat, because he understands the politics and the compromises that need to be made to get various measures through Parliament.
And it appears that the spreads, Italian bond spreads compared to German bonds, has been on the decline. So it seems like for now there seems to be confidence in the Italian.
I think more than anything else, relief.
Okay.
The government appears to be sufficiently moderate that some of the predictions that were made when Meloni topped the polls, that this would be a unrelievedly right-wing, far right-wing government, that hasn't materialized. And I think also the markets have got lots else to worry about, and the state of Italy drops down the league table, so to speak.
That's reassuring, at least for now. Can you comment? I thought it was interesting, possibly in contrast to other conservative governments, mostly in the US and the UK, when it comes to privatization. It seems like the Draghi government had started the process of managing ITA, which is the rebranded Alitalia national airline. And that seemed to have been a high priority for the new government. Can we make any inference of that, or what's going on?
Yeah, I think that that's one of the areas where we don't know yet. And it's one of the areas where the ideology, particularly of Fratelli d'Italia, which is by far the dominant party in the four-party coalition that is in government. The Fratelli d'Italia has a ranking of almost 30% at the moment in the polls, compared to 7 or 8 for Forza Italia, Silvio Berlusconi's party, and the League led by Matteo Salvini. And Fratelli d'Italia, stemming from the neo-fascist movement, has this corporatist, statist approach, also protectionist. So, they're not free marketeers, they're not free traders. And I think that is one area where they are certainly at risk of clashing with Brussels and with some of the other governments in Europe. There's a big emphasis on made in Italy, on also in terms of agriculture and food, grown in Italy. There is a reluctance to see too much foreign investment, whereas a lot of people would say that that's the very thing that Italy needs more of, because it's very low in the ranking of foreign direct investment. And I think that that is one of the controversial areas that we could see. I mean, broadly speaking, looking at the government, seems to me that if you look at the various areas, as far as genuine foreign policy, by which I mean non-European foreign policy is concerned, they're going to be pretty conventional. All the signs are is that they're going to be backing NATO, not giving any trouble to anybody over, for example, support to Ukraine, attitude to China, and what have you. In terms of domestic policy, and particularly perhaps cultural policy, that could be an area where we see Meloni give her people their head and allow them to be rather more hard rightist in their approach. And in between, I think, are the mystery areas, the areas where we're still not quite able to see where things are going to pan out. One of them being the economy, just how statist, corporatist, protectionist this government is going to be. And the other, I think, is in terms of Europe, the relationships with the other governments in Europe. And we've already seen problems arising over, for example, the issue of immigration.
Just going back to the Made in Italy, wasn't Berlusconi giving some sort of new appointee over managing Made in Italy and promoting Italian industry?
Yeah, I mean, he had this sort of national capitalistic approach, so that he would talk the talk of free trade, Thatcherite revolution, etc. But when push came to shove, he never walked the walk. And notably, for example, in the 2008 election, when it looked as if Alitalia was, as he would have put it, it was going to fall into the hands of the French and the Dutch, he decided to step in and get together a rather unlikely consortium that just succeeded in losing the Italian taxpayer large sums of money year after year. And that's ultimately led to the ITA solution. It is an emblematic case of how the country will not accept the kind of solutions that, for example, have been accepted with regard to airlines in Switzerland, for example. Swiss Air was the flag carrier of Switzerland, badge of national pride, etc., etc. But when the Swiss saw that it just wasn't working, they allowed it to be properly privatized. And I think that is going to be perhaps a bone of contention over the years to come.
So more populist than you would have thought, or were you expecting?
So far, I would say no, but I'm going to be interested to see the state of the budget. In other words, when it's gone through the whole of the parliamentary process. There are certain things in it which are, I don't know whether you would call them populist, but there's plenty of stuff in there to gladden the hearts of every tax dodger, for example. There's an increase in the limit on cash transactions from 2,000 to 5,000. There's an increase in the number of the limit on the point at which you must, sorry, wait a minute. There is an increase to 60 euros of the lower limit on the transactions that must be done electronically. Again, very helpful for promoting cash transactions, which of course are less traceable than those that go through an electronic trajectory. And there is also an amnesty for all the bills with the taxman before 2015, which are less than 1,000 euros. So all of those things combined, you know, just contribute to the idea that this is a government that wants to turn a blind eye to tax dodging. And that echoes an idea that's been prevalent on the Italian right, going way back to Christian Democrat times, the idea that if you allow small businesses to dodge their taxes, you will actually accelerate, you know, the money supply, and that you will get a more vibrant economy, which is a weird way of looking at things, particularly at the moment when the government is desperately in need of revenue, not only to pay off the debt that you were talking about earlier, but also to fund the tax cuts which have been promised, and which of course would be much fairer in their application than letting small businesses off the hook.
So speaking of tax cuts, the government recently proposed their new budget, and it seemed like there wasn't much pushback from the EU. One of the things that was in the headlines was the reduction or elimination, gradual elimination of the reddito di cittadinanza, the citizen income. I can't remember what the English translation is, but basically the welfare subsidy, and that took a lot of backlash. Is she, Meloni, picking her battles as far as who, because on the other hand, there are also more tax cuts for people with partita IVA, so maybe small businesses. Who is she trying to appeal to?
It's a very good question. I really, as a budget, it was a bit of this and a bit of that. And if you like, that perhaps is a justification for saying that she has moved in a slightly populist direction, because there was a little bit of something in it for everybody. The bulk of it, about 2/3, actually goes on measures to offset the effects of the energy crisis. That left her with very little room for maneuver. The result was a generally quite small budget. But there are bits and pieces that are given all over the place. One of the items that we will have to see whether it's actually included in the budget or whether it's put into another piece of legislation. But there was a declaration that they were going to abolish the reddito di cittadinanza, citizens' income, which is a kind of safety net benefit for those, originally intended for all those who fall through all the other qualifications, who end up, they exhaust their unemployment pay, or they never were entitled to it and therefore end up on the breadline. That's the idea of it. She said she was going to abolish it, but in cabinet, what happened was that her welfare minister said, if you do that immediately, overnight, there will be blood on the strings, because there are 2.5 million people living off this income, and roughly 70% of them are in the south of the country. And that was the point at which she decided that the best thing would be to put it off by 9 months. And the line coming out of the government since then has been that, well, we've got 9 months in which to put something else in its place, so don't worry too much. The idea is that it will be cut off initially for people who are capable of working and who are not doing so. So to use the British parlance, benefit scroungers. And indeed, what Italy is now facing is exactly the same dilemma that the Brits have had for many years, which is how do you deal with a poverty issue and at the same time make sure that people are not taking advantage of the state? The answer is you're always going to have an imperfect solution. And that may be what Italy is going to have to eventually deal with. But it has become a bit of a standard that she holds aloft, the abolition of this, because its negative effect has been to drain the labor market of an awful lot of people. A lot of people discovered that what they could do was live off this benefit, do a little bit of work on the black, as they say, and get by. And that was preferable to actually taking on a full-time job with the very heavy social security contributions that all Italian workers have to make. And in that sense, and to deal with that, the budget also includes a reduction in the social security contributions of workers. The employers are screaming for the same to be done for them sooner rather than later.
I didn't seem to see much as far as labor reform. Was there anything there? Or is that too much of a liability that they push off?
Yeah, I think that's something that they would be looking to do in, say, the 3rd year or the 4th year of their term, I would imagine, because that's always a thorny issue. But it is needed because Italy has a viciously divided labor market. You know, you've got on the one hand those who are the insiders, who've got an excessive amount of job security by any normal standards, and then you have the outsiders, the precari, as they're called in Italian, the precarious ones, who live from one short-term contract to the next. And the big difference is that most of the insiders are older people and most of the outsiders are young people, and it is an extraordinarily divisive setup.
So switching gears a little bit, a few weeks ago, I was driving north on the Autostrada near Modena. The off-ramp was closed and all we could see is all these blue lights flashing everywhere. We couldn't figure out what was going on. And of course it was the rave party that they shut down. But it was major news because they quickly passed a pretty strict law, possibly draconian, on the gathering, assembly of people. Can you just comment on that? Is there more there than, obviously it caused a lot of alarm?
Yeah, I think it goes to my point about how she may be intending to give her people their head in cultural areas. This was a measure that was approved in her very first cabinet meeting. I mean, here is a government that's facing, as you said, 150% of GDP debt, inflation, war in Ukraine, crazy gas prices, God knows what else. And, you know, the first measure that they approve is one to imprison the organizers of rave parties. I mean, it does seem like a very strange set of priorities. The original idea was that they could be banged up for 6 years. That has now been trimmed to 5. I suspect it might come down, and I very much suspect that nobody will actually be imprisoned as a result, because somehow that always happens in Italy, the land of eternal forgiveness. But I think it was also very much a sign to her people, you know, don't worry, yes, we're doing all these apparently liberal things, but actually we remain, you know, solidly right-wing at heart, and we'll have no nonsense from these kids organizing raids.
The other action that stirred a lot of controversy and concern in the Western world was Meloni's suing or lawsuit against Roberto Salviano, who, as most people know, was a writer that exposed a lot on the Camorra in, I guess, in the last 10, 15 years, wrote the show Camorra as well, and has been under protection for many years now. And he lashed out, I guess, and at Meloni and Salvini when one of the ships carrying the migrants were not allowed to unload, and a little boy, Joseph, I think his name was, died. And so I think he referred to them as how bastards or how
Stronzi, yeah,
Stronzi,
that's
yes.
right. Yes, he did. I mean, 2 points to make about
Yeah.
that. One is that this happened a while ago, before Meloni was prime minister, which I think is an important point. She was a party leader at the stage. Salvini is also suing him over the same remark, which in British law would not justify a case being brought because it would qualify as common abuse. And you can't libel somebody with common abuse. So he was not accusing them of anything. He was just using a unpleasant word about them. I think that it is an important case nevertheless, because it has focused attention on the use of what are known as slaps, which is libel cases brought by political figures by way of intimidation to journalists. Now, that is not just an issue of morality and ethics, and I think it's become much more important for two reasons. First of all, because of a realization that democracy around the world is in crisis. It needs all the help that it can get, and that a free press with all its inconveniences is a fundamental part of the democratic process, and that if politicians in power use their resources to bring cases against journalism, journalists, it has an intimidatory effect. So a lot of people are saying, yes, it was quite understandable that Meloni as a private citizen might bring this case, but you know, once she gets into power, that case should have actually been dropped straight away. So far, there's no sign that she's going to do it, nor that Salvini is going to do it. Second point about this is that the case has been brought under criminal libel laws, which have been abolished in the United Kingdom. I don't know about the United States, because they were thought to be iniquitous. What they say is that the libel is actually a crime, and therefore you have to pay for it, not with a fine, but by going to prison. Though judges in Italy particularly have shown themselves very reluctant to bring in guilty verdicts on criminal libel, it does happen from time to time. The third point, perhaps the most important point, is this, that a free press, and particularly investigative journalism, which Roberto Saviano doesn't really do, but there are many cases of this kind of suit being brought against investigative journalism. Investigative journalism is not just healthy, but is increasingly important in societies where the democracy is less than perfect. I'm thinking in particular about the West Balkans, for example, where it's quite clear that the press itself, the same would go for countries like Hungary and others in the east of Europe, where the open press, the mainstream press, is quite incapable of doing its job, because either the news outlet is owned by a crony of the prime minister or president, or because there is political pressure being brought to bear on the proprietors by means of restricting advertising, et cetera, et cetera. In those circumstances, you're very reliant on groups of investigative journalists, often working with funding from, for example, the EU. And if they are constantly having to fight law cases, Saviano rather at the moment has 14 pending. I know of colleagues in the Balkans who've got 30, 40 cases. And they are just incredibly time consuming, as well as just generally vexatious. And it is very important that some kind of control be exercised on politicians to stop them from doing this kind of thing.
So if we look at the government is split now in their stance and with regards to EU sanctions towards Hungary, for many of the same reasons. And back to the rave example of limiting effectively the amount of assembly, amount of people that can aggregate, and now going after specific journalists. Do you think these are independent incidents, or is there a strategy to sort of curtail the freedom of press, curtail the freedom of assembly?
You raise a point that I didn't mention in terms of the raves. I mean, the big worry that was floating at the back of that was that the way that the original legislation was worded could have allowed people not just to ban raves, but also to restrict the right of assembly. There is a potential pattern there, yes. And I think that that is slightly concerning. Let's hope that there is no further drift in that direction. Clearly, the EU is concerned that if it allows Orban to get away with too much in Hungary, that it would encourage others. And I think that the measures that the Commission has announced recently came as a surprise to most observers who had thought that they were going to, threaten again, but not actually go as far as they did. The decision on that is still pending. There's going to be a decision that's going to be taken at the political level in December, and it may be at that point that people back away. But I think there is a new spirit that the democracy, again, comes back to this point of democracy in crisis. Democracy has actually got to show that it is worthy of all that people are investing in it. And so I think that there is concern that Italy could start to drift in that direction under a leader who in the past has been very happy to get herself selfied with Orban.
So then a couple of weeks ago, we've had this sort of major incident with France over, again, migrant ships. If I'm correct, there are 4 ships in total, and the government refused to let the ships disembark. The first 3 were eventually let to disembark, but the 4th one wasn't. And that caused a very swift and strong reaction by France.
Yeah, to 2 things. First of all, the selective disembarkation of the 3, and then the fact that the 4th was basically shuffled off to France. What happened was that Meloni thanked the French for taking the vessel before apparently they had decided to do so, which was quite a cute move. The reaction, though, of the French, I think, took the government by surprise, in that it was extreme, and it was motivated by the fact that back in the summer, there was a deal among the EU countries, which was a first step towards a sensible policy of redistribution. It's very modest, but it was going in the right way. And all of a sudden, here is one of the signatories to that deal saying, no, we're not going to take anybody. Right? And that wasn't the idea. The idea was that you take people in, you deal with them in a civilized manner, and then you make sure that some of them go off to another country. The other context here is the fact that because of Ukraine, the huge number of refugees have been taken in by countries in Eastern Europe, also by countries such as Germany. And at the moment, for example, there are over 1 million illegal or unauthorized migrants in Germany, whereas the figure that's generally accepted in Italy is less than half that number. So there was also an aspect of, you think you've got problems, well, look at us. And I think there was a third dimension here. And here I'm getting into speculation, pure speculation by me, not based on anything. But I noticed that after his meeting with Meloni, Macron, the very first person to visit her, looked very worried. He was not smiling in the pictures that were taken afterwards. And I wonder whether he and Scholz in Germany just didn't decide, right, the first time that she steps out of line, we're going to come down on her like a ton of bricks. That's what it felt like.
Yeah, because also Germany, as you said, and Spain quickly went on France's side. So it was a very isolating message, it seemed like. And as far as we recently had some significant events in China, maybe we start there. As recent as yesterday and today, anti-lockdown measures. Can you maybe touch on that a little bit? And
I mean, first of all, a health warning that I'm certainly no sinologist. My expertise is about this country and to a lesser extent, countries that I've covered in the past and where I've been based, like Spain and Germany. So I'm no better informed, probably less well informed than some of you in the audience, though I do follow the news, obviously, very carefully as a part of my profession. I mean, it seems to me that we talked about the Arab Spring. We seem to be seeing a kind of global autumn. The signs of this popular discontent, which is intriguing, because I think that up until quite recently, we felt that democracy was on the retreat, partly because of the Chinese authoritarian economic model being so successful. Certainly in many developing countries, people said, well, Europe's not doing particularly well, nor perhaps is America, but China is doing brilliantly, and that maybe is the price that has to be paid in terms of political liberty for economic success. What we've seen recently is that large numbers of people in extremely repressive countries have felt strongly enough that freedom was worth fighting for, and risking imprisonment, harassment and torture. We saw this in Belarus, was the first place. We're seeing this in Iran, and now we're seeing it in China. And I think that overall, it's a very helpful, a very hopeful, sign. Having said that, I think that all three cases are very different. And what we're seeing in China may be a relatively brief experience. China has shown in the past that it's prepared to use extreme levels of violence to repress popular expressions of discontent. And the same is true also of Iran. And I think that's where you get a commonality. In both countries, there is clearly in Iran and just perhaps perceptible in China, a move to say this is not a popular uprising. This is actually, in the case of Iran, a Kurdish revolt, because the woman who was at the beginning of all of this, who was seemingly beaten to death by the religious police, came from that area, and that has been an area which has seen some of the most active resistance. The same in China, because the original motivation was a fire last Thursday in a lockdown hotel in which 10 people died up in Urumqi in Xinjiang, which is the area of the Uyghurs, who have constantly provoked concern in the Chinese authorities because they see them as being potentially Islamist fundamentalists. And so, yeah, there's this is, I think, a standard response to say this isn't just a popular desire for. We saw it also actually in Syria, where the regime very successfully turned attention onto the fundamentalist protesters, ignoring the fact that large numbers of Syrians did actually want a more democratic and certainly less oppressive society.
And now changing continents, the US elections. Were you surprised?
The midterms, yes. I think everybody was, because the polls had indicated that there could indeed be a red wave, a Republican resurgence, and it didn't happen. Not only that, but there was an identifiable pattern in which the candidates who either were endorsed openly by Trump or who had become what has become known as electoral deniers, those who questioned the outcome of the election that Trump lost, those candidates did disproportionately badly. And that we saw not just an unusual pattern of an incumbent government holding its own in the midterms, but a Republican Party that seemed to be recovering what you might call normal and mainstream conservatism as a value worth standing up for. And I think that that is another very hopeful sign that we are seeing people perhaps pulling back from having seen polarization, having seen sensible people both on the right and the left talking about the possibility that the United States was going to have a second civil war. I mean, I think that at that point, a lot of people on the right thought, I don't want to go there. I really don't want to go there. What I would like to see a little bit more of is the same sentiment perhaps on the left, where a highly intolerant form of radicalism has emerged that is like a red rag to a bull for people of a red in the terms of Republican persuasion.
So a blow to Trump, populism in the US, and a blow to Putin as well?
I think so. I can't see at the moment, though his powers of persuasion have proved extraordinary in the past, that Trump will be getting the Republican nomination next time round. I wish that, though, I could hear from Mr. Biden that he won't be standing next time round. because he can't find age, and I think it's implausible to expect that he will be serving out his next term as president. And I'm sure there are people in the Democratic Party who could give any Republican a run for his or her money. So all to play for still.
So just aware of the time, maybe I'll ask one last question on Ukraine and then we'll open it up to questions. So I think I read that Russia now occupies 17% of Ukraine, which is one of the lowest percentages since the beginning of the invasion. And with the retreat at Kherson, it seems like things were going in a positive direction. I did see a picture at night of Ukraine and it's mostly dark. And I have a feeling it's not just for safety, but actually some major energy warfare going on. At this point, what do you think are the likely scenarios right now?
As we say in journalism, always leave the hard question until the end. I think that all you can say is to identify what you might call vectors pushing in different directions. The energy infrastructure attacks have clearly taken a big toll. So far, I don't see it doing anything more than making the Ukrainians that much more bloody minded and determined to sit it out. But that could change. And that is one of the things that I will be watching for. The other is the supply of appropriate arms to the Ukrainians from the West, and how long that could continue, how long the Russian supply of arms will hold out, and whether, and this is where we go back to Iran, moves can be made to stem the flow of, for example, drones from Iran. And then finally, the two big question marks in Russia. One of them, popular sentiment. Putin is trying to do what Russian leaders have done right back to the Middle Ages, which is to win wars by pouring in human capital, which is the one thing that Russia is richest in. But the Russia of today is not the Russia of then, or even the Russia of 30, 40 years ago. It's a Russia in which people do know about the outside world. They are aware of countries where people have human rights and democratic entitlements. And we've seen in the reaction to the draft, tens, probably hundreds of thousands of young men fleeing the country. Could there be civil resistance on a significant scale? That's one question. The other question, I think, this is utterly unknowable, seemingly even to the best informed intelligence services, which is what's going on in the Kremlin, and how thin is the patience of some of the people around Putin with the clear evidence that Russia has not achieved its war objectives so far.
Great, thank you. I know that was a difficult question. We'd like to open it up. Yep. So
the usual rules. If you're on the Zoom and want to join in, wave at us, or indeed just unmute yourself and say something. In the room, we put up hands, and we got somebody here to start with.
Thank you. Not British, American. I've been reading about the rise of Christian nationalism in the United States, especially the Catholic Church's role in Christian nationalism. I wonder how that's affecting Italy. How's the Vatican responding to the Meloni government, and what role are they playing in the movement towards more nationalist policies?
Very interesting question. the silence from the Vatican has been deafening right the way through the electoral campaign and since the inauguration of the government. Francis has said nothing that would really be read or be readable as either support of or opposition to the current government. That can be read in various ways. It can be read in terms of the fact that Francis himself is more, certainly within church terms, more left-leaning than right-leaning, though his political formation was in an Argentina dominated by Peronism. So he's no stranger to populism, and he is in some ways a populist pope. He's somebody who likes to get his message through directly to the faithful rather than have the mediation of the means of communication. So he's an intriguing mixture in that respect. The other way I think that it can be read is that he's got enough problems on his plate as it is, with the trial in the Vatican over the Vatican's finances, which is possibly going to rebound on him, and this very serious split in the German church, which is drifting further and further away from the Vatican line on a whole range of issues. So I think that we're waiting to see exactly what he feels about this, and since it is an absolute monarchy, the Vatican, it's what he feels that is going to count. Everybody else is going to have to fall in line with that. So far, very little sign yet, though, that the Vatican wants to get involved in the kind of Catholic nationalism that you're talking about. I think there is a feeling that times have changed, and there is no evidence yet that the Meloni government wants to move on the one issue which might win over the Vatican, which is abortion. They might move to make it a little bit more restricted, but Meloni and her people have said over and over again, we are not going to touch the law, the existing law.
To answer the question, the chat from Randall, John said he didn't think that he did not think that Trump would get the nomination. Anyone on the Zoom want to join in? Then we'll go back to the room. Here.
Hi. Hello.
Can we just do Brenda first? Brenda, go.
Yeah, hi. Thank you. Thank you both for a very, very interesting discussion. You covered quite a number of topics. There are two things I'd just like to address. The question of immigration. One of the things that has been clear to me, and not just me, is that there have been a lot of inequalities about immigration, inequalities, racial inequalities in terms of immigration policy. In other words, since the Ukrainian war, Ukrainians have been granted full rights within my country, in Ireland, and I think in many other places. I'm just wondering, is this an issue here in Italy? Because Italy has taken an unfair burden, in my view, of the amount of immigration, and the EU has sadly, I think, not supported Italy adequately in this. But my real question is about the inequalities of treatment of the immigrants coming in. And if you could bear with me about the US elections, I just would like to ask, do you think that the reversal of Roe versus Wade had a significant impact among young people and women in terms of the midterm elections, the resistance to the reversal?
Let me just answer those in reverse order, Brenda. Yes, to Roe v. Wade. I think that it did have an effect. And on the other question, yeah, you've seen a clearly different attitude in Europe to white people who look and sound like us, coming in from Ukraine, as distinct from Black people landing off boats in the south of Italy, south of Spain, Greece, etc. So, and that actually surfaced before the election in something that Meloni said, because she said that they were combating the influx of people across the Mediterranean, but she was admitting, and this is an interesting aspect of Fratelli d'Italia's outlook on this issue, that they have always recognized that Italy, because of its low birth rate, has a problem and needs at the moment immigration. What she said was, well, why don't we take in people from Venezuela? There are lots of people there who want to leave the country, and a lot of them are Italian descent. So that was a clearly discriminatory approach. The aspect of the low birth rate, just to round off what I said there, Fratelli d'Italia puts actually at the top of its election manifesto, saying that the only way in which Italy can deal with this problem is to make sure that Italian women have more children, and that measures need to be taken to make that happen. And indeed, the budget that we were talking about earlier contains the first measures designed to encourage Italian women to breed more in the future.
Thank you.
Hello, I have a question about the economy. If we look at the current crisis we are living in, which is, I think, exceptional, high interest rates, high inflation, high energy prices, and so on, how strong is the Italian economy to go through this crisis? And how strong do you think are the small and medium companies in this country, which is the backbone of the Italian economy? How strong are they to go through this crisis? And an unrelated question to this is, how do you think, how about the chances of the Vatican to become a peace mediator between Ukraine and Russia?
Again, I'd like to take those in reverse order. I don't think that the Vatican might be able to play a role in mediation, but it is very clearly aligned with one country. The relations between the Vatican and Russian Orthodoxy have always been much more problematic than between the Vatican and Greek Orthodoxy. So it would not be a neutral player in such a scenario. On the economic question, consistently, Italy has been more vulnerable to shocks and to crises economically than most other countries in Europe because of its inability to grow. And I think this is something that actually Italians only grasp in part just how bad Italy's record has been. And they, I think, often express surprise, particularly when my own magazine criticizes Italy, because the politicians are always telling them that everything is okay, and that gets reflected in the media, or that things aren't too bad anyway. GDP per capita, which is the normal measure of income, is lower in Italy today than it was in the year 2000. And that's a unique case in Europe. If you go back to 1989, which is, if you like, the start of globalization, there are very few countries that have grown less than the Italian, than Italy in that period. When a survey was done about 5-6 years ago, the only countries that had fared worse, apart from some ex-Soviet republics, which had had the whole crisis after the fall of the wall, were Haiti and Zimbabwe. I mean, it's not bad. So Italy, very vulnerable, not least because of the debt that Morgan mentioned earlier on, because that means that Italy cannot spend its way out of situations, which may well be required if this energy crisis goes on and on and on and on. I think we're already getting quite close to the limits of what Italy can do in the current budget. It's also vulnerable in the sense, not quite in the sense that you alluded to. I think that the structural weakness of the Italian economy is not so much to be found in the area of the small and medium-sized companies. It's the lack of big companies, which tend to be much more resistant to this kind of a shock. So in a sense, yes, what you say is true. Because there are so many of those small companies, which are very actively promoted by the government with the rhetoric of, frankly, the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, the bigger companies don't get the support that is required, and there aren't enough of them. If you think about it, very few of these companies are not either state-owned in part or slightly, or their family concerns, which have their own weaknesses.
Peter, we'll come to you in a moment. We got one here from Chris, but before I go there, somebody on the chat wants to know whether Maloney's will have a different relationship with UK, particularly with regard to visas and things. I suspect that's more of an EU problem because of Brexit than bilateral, but you might comment on that. And then, but wait for that. We'll get Chris's question first, and then.
Okay.
Just a quick comment on the last question, and then a question for you. Yeah, I mean, it's always going to be absolutely impossible for a country to grow if you make it impossible to fire workers, quite frankly, and if you charge enormous taxes on top of their salaries in order to employ them in the first place. And that's always been Italy's and France's problem. So big companies don't come here and set up infrastructure. It's just too dangerous. My question is, we talked a lot about, or you talked a lot about the different tax cuts that the government's making. But what tax increases are they going to make to sort of balance the budget? What's going on there?
There are no very significant tax increases. The simple answer to that is that they're not going to balance the books. They are actually going to incur a small amount of extra debt, small in terms of government accounts. She originally said, Meloni, that she wanted to stick to absolute fiscal prudence, not take on any debt. Given the immensity of the energy crisis and the need to cut the bollette, the bills, she eventually found that she had to go a bit further into extra borrowing, but not so far as to alarm the markets. But so far, I mean, it does take us back to this point when I was talking about, encouraging tax dodging, because this is a government that's going to need revenue, and sooner or later it's going to have to find some way in which to boost its revenue significantly if it wants to bring down the debt. There are small increases in, for example, they've increased the tax on cigarettes. There is a small increase on some other sin. It's very much at the margin, very, very small. They're relying on the debt just to get them through until next year. the big question, I think, is if this energy crisis continues, how long this government can go on pouring tens of billions of euros into keeping down the bills.
I think there's also going to be a large tax on energy companies, a one-time a windfall tax.
Yes, that certainly, that is an important part of the energy measures. That goes up from 25 up to 33%, I think. So yes, of course, that is an important qualification that Morgan's made there.
And I think the budget is aimed to fall within 4% of GDP sort of deficit, which is within the parameters of allowable in the EU.
There was another point that was made.
It was about Maloney and Britain and visas
Yes, I
and
can
immigration.
give quite an interesting answer to that, actually. I spoke to a lot of people during the electoral campaign who were some people who were close to the Fratelli d'Italia party. And there was a feeling that they wanted to reach out to the English-speaking world, I think sensing that they might become rather isolated within Europe. And the original plan, while it looked as if Liz Truss was going to be the Prime Minister, was that Meloni was going to visit London first. That's not happened. And so maybe those ideas have been put a bit on the back burner. But I know that before the election, as party leader of Fratelli d'Italia, she did reach out both to the Republican Party. She went, in fact, to an important high-level conference in America, and also to conservatives in Australia.
I'm going to do one more question because we're running out of time, and then we can continue the conversation over the wine afterwards. But Peter, I think you wanted to ask something. No? Yes?
Well, if I may, to follow up this question of the structural weaknesses, we don't have big companies, we have small companies. We don't have big companies because of the taxes and the cost of employing people, the impossibility to breathe. But one thing I always found about Italy, that the small companies never have any ambition to grow. If you look at Germany, it is actually the small companies that drive the economy that grow to become big companies. They're still very largely private held. They're all brand names that we all know. So Germany isn't dominated by the big corporates, it's actually dominated by the big private companies, which have grown from small. So is it not the lack of ambition, and that's a cultural issue rather than anything else, apart from being helped along by tax evasion and all these other things?
Very interesting point that you raised, and it came up, in fact, in a series of talks and panels that we did during the pandemic about the shape of Florence afterwards, because it was pointed out that some of the most prestigious companies in Florence emerged from very small beginnings. Ferragamo, for example, is one. And part of what emerged during that were complaints by Florentines that today's small company owners were not sufficiently ambitious, and that there was a cultural dimension, if you like, to it. But I think there are also very important practical dimensions. For a long time, it was, and I think that this still exists, that there is a disincentive to grow beyond a certain point in terms of your contributions on behalf of your workers. So that will deter people from growing. And I think also a sentiment which I've heard from a lot of business people in Italy, which is, so long as you don't get involved with the government, you're okay. So long as you don't get involved with the administration in its widest sense. And obviously, as you grow, there's no way you're going to be able to avoid dealing with the authorities. And I think that's somewhere between an economic objective consideration and a cultural subjective one. But it is true that we're not seeing the kind of growth or indeed a startup culture, partly, I think, because of the difficulties also facing very young companies, the lack, for example, of a venture capitalist environment or ecosystem in this country being one of them.
Morgan,
I
the
just
last
wrote
word.
one last quick question. Speaking of ambition, the bridge connecting Sicily to mainland Italy. Are we going to be able to drive to Sicily?
Probably not in our lifetime. The big problem there is often said to be that it'd be throwing money to the 'Ndrangheta on one side of the straits and Cosa Nostra on the other side. And I think that's part of the problem. The other, I think, more substantial problem is that the infrastructure on both sides of the putative bridge is just not sufficiently developed to deal with the traffic. And I think what you get is a situation such as we have at the moment, whereby Salvini is saying that it will be a priority for the government to get this done as a way of keeping the Sicilians happy and make them feel loved. And I suspect that there will be some kind of a grand feasibility study carried out, which will then molder for around about the time, until about the time that you and I are pushing up the daisies.
Thank you.
All right. Well, on that realistic, if slightly pessimistic note, I just want to thank John Hooper and Morgan Fiumi very much indeed for this interesting and enlightening conversation, which could have gone on all night, but we have to stop now, and we can carry on over a glass of wine. So thank you very much. And just before I let you go get the wine, there's just two more things I want to say. Good night to all the Zoomers. Thanks for being here. Sarah's put up the usual reminder to make a contribution if you feel like helping us. And on a allied theme, I want to thank Michael Griffith, who's here with us tonight, who has been our platinum sponsor for the first autumn season of the cultural program in the library. Thank you, Michael. Good night. And by extension from that, we are in the market for sponsors for the cultural program from January onwards. So if anyone would like to do that, come and talk to me. The platinum sponsors get to sponsor the entire season through to April. Gold is for a month, and a silver is just an individual session. So anyone feeling that they want to help us to keep this going and growing, come and talk to me about that. And having done my duty to raise funds for the independent, not unfunded, non-governmental British Institute of Florence, I invite you all to come and have a glass of wine in the other room. Thank you very much.